Hello everyone, this is Jackson Romero and welcome back to How to Policy Debate. As we continue to learn the basics of this event, I imagine that knowing the speeches in policy is probably an important part of doing well at tournaments. So, I know I've alluded to specific speeches in the past, but here they all are. Let's start at the top with the first affirmative constructive, or 1AC. This will be a pre-written speech that proposes a plan under the resolution and presents advantages to doing the plan. Most often, 1ACs will have 1 to 3 advantages and sometimes what's called a framing page. In this case, framing isn't an argument for why the effects of the plan are good, but instead a longer philosophical argument about what type of impacts matter in the debate. For example, if a team reads a case saying that the plan is a good idea because it combats racism, they may also read a framing page about the importance of fighting and rejecting racism. This serves to give the affirmative leverage later in the debate when it comes time to do impact calculus. Overall, the 1AC is pretty simple. The AF proposes a plan and says why it's a good idea. Next comes the 1NC. Now, normally before a debate round, policy teams will do what's called disclosing, in which the affirmative tells the negative team the general outline of the AF, and the neg team tells the affirmative team which off-case positions they've collapsed to in their last two 2NRs, the last speech that the negative gives. This serves to give the neg extra time to write a good 1NC in response to the AF, and lets the AF know what kind of arguments the negative likes to read. So, before the round, with a rough idea of the AF already known, the negative team will begin to craft a 1NC that presents new off-case arguments for why the plan is bad, and responds to the AF's own advantages in the form of on-case responses. If you need an overview of off and on-case positions, that's covered in the first video of this series. Generally, 1NCs will contain 3 to 6 off-case positions. While the 1NC isn't entirely pre-written, it is generally made up almost entirely of cards that the neg team should have already prepared in drag-and-drop style shells, if the affirmative is common, that is. If the neg team does not have a lot, or possibly no prep for the affirmative's plan, then they will have to scrounge for responses in their back files, and maybe even cut cards during the round. After the 1NC is the 2AC, in which the affirmative answers the 1NC. Big shocker, I know. A good 2AC must answer each off-case position the negative reads in the 1NC and refute on-case responses in order to regain the AF's advantages. Similar to the 1NC, a 2AC will often compose of a lot of drag-and-drop shelled responses to generic off-case arguments, but unique responses by the negative will require finding or cutting more obscure cards. Where the 2AC divulges from the 1NC is when it comes to on-case responses that the negative made. Instead of answering these responses with cards, the 2AC will generally just refute the on-case responses with a re-explanation of the warrants of the 1AC evidence, at least when it comes to defensive arguments. Offensive responses like link or impact turns will require the 2AC to read new evidence. On to the 2NC and the 1NR. These speeches are collectively called the block because the negative gets 2 back-to-back speeches. After the 1NC, the negative cannot, as a general principle, introduce new off-case positions, so the entire block consists of, ideally, absolutely hammering the affirmative from as many angles as possible. The goal of the block is to make the AF's next speech, the 1AR, as hard as humanly possible. A good block strategy generally consists of kicking off-case positions the negative doesn't want to defend, and instead hammering home and expanding upon the off-case arguments that the 2AC was worst at responding to. There's no real difference between the content of the 2NC and 1NR, other than teammates dividing arguments up based on preference and expertise. After the block comes one of the hardest speeches in debate, the first affirmative rebuttal, or 1AR. The 1AR must answer a total of 13 minutes of negative speech time with only 5 minutes of affirmative speech time. A good 1AR needs to pick and choose which arguments are the most threatening and respond to those well. A lot less worrying arguments fall by the wayside in this speech. The 1AR is all about time allocation and word efficiency. The speech will never be able to completely answer the block, not even close, so it must instead narrow the AF's arguments to the ones that the AF is winning, setting up a winning 2AR. Next, the 2NR is the last time that the negative gets to speak in the debate. The negative should have kicked out of almost all of their off-case positions, now only defending 1, maybe 2. This speech should focus on block arguments that were not adequately responded to by the 1NR and present the neg's final case to the judge for why they've won a debate. A good 2NR will also preempt arguments that they believe the 2AR may make, oftentimes by telling the judge something along the lines of, if my opponent gets up and says this, don't buy it because blank. The 2NR should be focused around all of the offensive arguments that the negative is winning, painting a clear picture for a negative ballot at the end of the round. Finally, the 2AR is the last speech of the debate. Because the affirmative speaks last, a 2AR oftentimes gets away with making the debate seem a lot more AF-friendly than it was in reality, because the negative doesn't get any response to what's said in the 2AR, because there isn't a 3NR. Similar to the 2NR, the AF should have now consolidated down to just a few arguments that they feel they're winning strongly, and they must give a clear and concise rationale for why the judge should vote AF. Now, there's one thing that's gone unmentioned, and that's the 3-minute cross-examinations that occur after each constructive speech. This is because there is no real strategy difference between the different cross-exes. In each cross-ex, the speaker of the second most recent constructive questions the speaker of the most recent constructive, except for the 1AC, who is questioned by the speaker of the 2NC. Just to clarify, the 1NC speaker is cross-exed by the 1AC speaker, the 2AC speaker is cross-exed by the 1NC speaker, and so on. Cross-exes will be covered much more in depth in a later video, but for now, you just have to know that they follow every constructive speech. The final thing to cover is speaking positions. As a general principle that is almost always followed, the first affirmative speaker will also be the second negative speaker, and the second affirmative speaker will be the first negative speaker. These roles are called 1A2N and 2A1N. So you can see here which speeches each speaker generally gives. For example, I'm a 2A1N, so when Rajiv and I are on AF, I give the 2AC and the 2AR, and when we're on neg, I give the 1NC and the 1NR. As a general rule of thumb, the second speaker calls the shots for a side, so when we're on AF, I get to make the strategic decisions for the team, and when we're on neg, Rajiv is the one in charge. Where this can become unique in policy debate is that sometimes the 2N will write the 1NC, even though they're not the one giving the speech, because they're in charge of negative strategy and strategic vision for the round. Rajiv and I do this, so oftentimes the first time I get to see the 1NC is when I get up to read it in round, because Rajiv's been the one who's been working on it the whole time. And that about covers it all. For a quick recap, this video covered all of the speeches present in policy debate, and the speaking positions that debaters generally take. Each of these speeches will eventually have its own dedicated video, but this was the quick and dirty overview of how each speech functions within a round. Thank you for watching. Wish yourself good luck in your next debate tournament, unless, of course, I'm the one who's debating you.